Good afternoon from Pretoria in South Africa. My name is Barney Pityana. I live and work in Pretoria, and we have been under lockdown in South Africa for the last 72 or 73 days. Living as I do in the suburbs of Pretoria, my wife and I have kept very much to the regulations and the provisions provided by the government for lockdown. We're very, very conscious that at our age, we are considered vulnerable, and therefore we're not inclined to take any risks. The purpose of this is really to share with you what life is like under lockdown in South Africa. Lockdown here has been different, depends who you're talking to. I've had the privilege, I think, of catching up on a lot of the work that I'd always wanted to do. A fair amount of reading, a large amount of writing, following up on things that I've not had time to do. And so it's been pretty hectic. The other factor, of course, in this age we're in, is that all meetings now are held using Zoom or Microsoft Teams. And I found those very, very intrusive, whilst convenient. It's been possible to have quite a lot of our meetings using Zoom. And that has taken up quite a lot of one's time to be locked down, as it were, and having to live through Zoom. But at the same time, we've appreciated, for example, at our church at St. Albans Cathedral, we've taken very strongly to doing our Sunday Mass on Zoom. And it's just amazing how many people actually participate in this. Roughly about 110, 112 people. And if that's a household, that's probably 3 to 5 other people. So it's actually quite a large participation rate. As much as, if at times not better than what we get ordinarily on an ordinary Sunday at the cathedral in Pretoria. We have about 350 people at the Sunday morning Mass. The Bishop, Alan Kannemeyer, and the Dean, Danny Adonis, have been quite diligent in ensuring that as parishioners, we are kept abreast with what is happening. And of course, this week there have been a very strange turn of events that have just come together. First, in the week, of course, there was some controversy around the regulations on the extended COVID regulations. And the regulations have been drawing quite some controversy here. First, it was pressure by the tobacco lobby on the sale of tobacco during the lockdown. And the government has been quite insistent that actually to provide for the sale of cigarettes and tobacco products would cause a danger to the health, especially those who are affected by COVID. And then there's been controversy around the sale of alcohol. What was most astounding, I think, is that as of the 1st of June, government allowed limited opening hours for the sale of alcohol, and it had to be sold off sales from Monday to Friday between 9 and 5, from Monday to Thursday between 9 and 5. The first 2, if not 3 days of the opening were an eye-opener for many of us. because the queues, large numbers of people who were queuing to buy alcohol was something of a shock, because we generally tend to assume that people in the country are not well enough to afford a luxury like alcohol. But quite a large number of people were there, amazingly surprising and indeed shocking. But the other side of it is that during the time when there was no alcohol sales, people made home brews, concoctions, which in some instances have killed a number of people who were indulging in this home brew, which apparently were quite lethal and had lots in them that was not supposed to be consumed by human beings. And so this idea of being a society where alcohol matters so much, I'm almost inclined to say a society and a community of drinkers, is something that is quite contrary to what some of us would like to believe, especially because we've been among those and the churches have applied a lot of pressure on government to recognize that this lockdown in an environment of extreme inequality that our country has will mean that quite a number of people, not only are there some parts of our communities that are densely populated, and it's going to mean that infections are very, very easy, and infections would spread like wildfire. Secondly, we realize that there are many people who survive by informal activity, informal trading at times, that they are able to find food even though they are out of work. And the government has made provision for a limited amount of funds to be made available to the unemployed and the people who are at home. They've increased social grants to families with children, and other forms of social grants have been increased. So I think we are some of us think, in an environment where we are now going to recognize that there are large numbers of people whom poverty and unemployment, homelessness is a generator of a great deal of antisocial activity, besides the fact that health-wise, you can't expect people to live healthy lives if they haven't got food to eat. Thirdly, there was some controversy from the courts. First, there's been ongoing concern as to whether the regulations that have been passed are legal in terms of our constitutional state. And secondly, there was a question as to whether the way in which the state of disaster was organized and declared was lawful in terms of our constitution. First up was a case that went to court about the regulations, especially because in a township called Alexander, which is near a very affluent area called Sandton in the north of Johannesburg, in Alex, the army that had been deployed and the security forces and all of that have been acting in a very hard manner in enforcing compliance by the people, even to the point of raiding people in their homes, trying to find if there's any alcohol, which should not be there, and whether people are maintaining a social distance as they should, and whether in the homes there is more people than in fact live in that house. Now that's very difficult in a country where living has become so informal and that you can never quite know who lives in this house and who doesn't. So that was actually quite a formative thing. The court in that instance made some very shocking findings. The court basically found that the regulations that were imposed by government were irrational and therefore unconstitutional. And there were, in fact, some of those regulations that absolutely didn't make sense for many of us. There were regulations like you can buy a T-shirt provided you wear it under another outer clothing. You can't wear shoes that are open toes that are not covered. You can only exercise between the hours of 6 a.m. in the morning and 9 a.m. At funerals, there had to be only 20 people. They must maintain a social and physical distance, and it had to be within 1 hour. The funeral must finish within an hour, etc., etc. So those were fairly draconian rules that were imposed. And the court said that many of these rules actually were irrational and therefore unlawful. In other words, they had no substance in law. There's no connection, no nexus between the regulation itself and the intended outcome. And so the court then said that the government must go back and redraft those regulations and remove the offensive regulations or reorganize them. The state, of course, has now said that they are going to appeal that particular judgment. Now, because this was a judgment around somebody who had died in the hands of the police or the army in that case, there were consequences which the government was concerned about. Then there was another case which came with a similar finding around the regulations which were being attacked by certain civil society organizations to say they are totally unlawful. Now, both of those have introduced a level of uncertainty about the state of disaster and the capacity of government to do what it does. I mean, I'm prepared to say, for one thing, that some of the ministers seem to have taken to these regulations. You would think that they're a group of children being let loose in a toy shop. The gusto and the enthusiasm with which they do these things, at times they do go overboard in violating the rights of people. And sometimes they behave like they believe that the disaster regulations actually give them the power to violate the human rights of citizens. So there have been some genuine considerations about that. Having said that, there was also a caution that needed to be applied, that we know that the infections are increasing. We know that there are many people who do not obey or abide by or comply with the regulations. To then say that by the courts, for the courts to say that certain regulations are unlawful, is basically to invite people to disobey. And some of us thought that it was rather unwise of the courts to do that at this point in time. But both of those decisions are being taken up. The third one that was a matter of controversy, I think, was in the second stage of the lockdown beginning on the 1st of June. The president announced that the churches would now be allowed to gather for worship on Sundays in the church buildings, provided certain strict conditions were observed. And secondly, church ministers or people accredited by the churches will be allowed with a designation called essential service workers, meaning that they would not be confined. They can go visit their parishioners and they can go minister to people in their homes, which was something that was not available up to now. There are two concerns about that. The first one is that the nature and the variety of the churches that there are in South Africa, for many of them, the very idea of abiding by the lockdown regulations was going to be both expensive and inconvenient. To make it worthwhile, they needed to have more than 50 people in a church building, but now they are being limited to 50. To maintain social distance was going to be very difficult. To police, to use the sanitizers and all of these things that are expected of them, to deep clean the church after every service was going to be just cost-wise, just prohibitive, and administratively and organizationally, just something that would be simply impossible to do and impossible to police. The second thing was that there was a sense in which the president was far too sympathetic to the churches, and that he was more inclined to respond positively to the pressure that it is thought that the churches put on him. Ironically, no sooner was that announcement made with all the resolutions than a number of the churches, including the Anglican Church of Southern Africa, have announced that they will not be able to open churches for worship because they were not ready with all the requirements for opening the churches. But there are some other churches in South Africa which don't meet in a church building in any event. They meet under the trees, they meet in the bushes, they meet elsewhere. And the nature of how they become church is such that it will be very difficult to regulate and to police, because they have to dance and they have to beat drums and they have to shake and all of that. And it was considered this stricture was not likely to be possible for them as well. And also, finally, there was a problem and a concern about rural churches as opposed to urban churches in the rural areas. And many of them in the non-mainline churches, the Zionist churches, etc., it was impossible for them to do this. So chances were that in many instances, the infections have come through churches and through funerals in many of our communities. And there is a sense in which, how is this going to actually work out? But for churches, they had two other concerns. And these were not always clearly verbalized. One of them was that just in financial terms, there's a culture here. People only contribute to church by their presence and through their presence. So in the collection plate, that's when most people think that they need to contribute to church. For many churches, there was a complaint that without meeting, it means that their capacity to generate resources was diminished. The second thing was, how do you really become church in a new environment? How adequate is it to use technology? And some people were concerned that after these regulations have been finished, it's going to be very difficult to have church in a traditional way. And so there's a whole need to really think about how church can continue, how meaningful it can be, and how the old ways of doing the Eucharist and doing services was actually going to continue afterwards. And many churches, especially the mainline churches, this is a difficult area of engagement. So there's a lot of theological reflection that is beginning to happen about what would the church post COVID-19 going to look like? What is ministry going to seem to be like, etc. Of course, in the last week, a lot of this, in a sense, COVID has been overtaken by the events in Minneapolis, Black Lives Matter, the murder by the police of an African-American man under arrest, who was, the police leaned on his neck, and he was heard to cry, "I can't breathe," and that just didn't get the police to be interested in what was. So they continued to hold him down until he died. Now, all over the world, there's been protests about police brutality. In South Africa, there's a resurgence of protests about police brutality, not least because the young man who was killed by the army in Alexander, the matter was not resolved. And the government this week issued a statement to say that nobody was to blame. And that harks back on the policing methods of the apartheid era, where many people were killed, and they were later told that nobody was to blame. And that's a very sensitive matter. Right now, there are protests all over the country. There's protests in front of the American Embassy in Pretoria here. There are protests in Cape Town at the Consulate General of the United States of America. So this has kind of raised the issue of policing and policing method and the brutality that police continue to exercise in South Africa today. It appears, it is suggested that the COVID regulations seem to have given the police power to violate the rights of people. And they can do so without impunity, because the COVID regulations that have been promulgated make it very clear that nobody who has acted in the course of enforcement of the regulations will bear responsibility for any allegations of violations that may have been necessary to execute his or her duties. So right now we've been told now that the lockdown is going to be extended until the 15th of July, which means that there would have been lockdown in South Africa from the 23rd of March until the 15th of July, as it is now intended. I think there's a sense of fatigue at the moment. South Africans are getting very edgy. And there is a real danger, if government doesn't take notice, that people are just going to go to the streets and defy the orders. Today, there was an opening of schools, a limited partial opening of schools, which had been closed since about the 23rd of March. Now, this gradual and partial opening of schools also requires quite a lot of preparation. The deep cleaning of the school and provision of facility, making sure that the classrooms are made a lot thinner than they have been, and that the groups and distancing are observed. There's a huge controversy with the government saying schools, 95% of the schools are ready, and the unions and the teachers and educators saying, no, they are not ready as far as we are concerned. It's no more than 90%. And the amazing moral question, in my view, arises. Is it in fact morally justifiable to insist that if some of the schools are not ready, then all the schools are not ready? Is it in fact acceptable to the 95% of the learners whose schools are ready to say they mustn't go to school because 5% is not ready? So that is what is being played out at the moment. It's difficult to know what the resolution of that is going to be. What is astounding, I think, for me, is that not only teachers and educators, but also parents seem to be content with children staying at home and not going to school. And I would have thought that what communities would be doing would be to insist that our children must be at school. Because for many of them, they are not able in any event to do the online learning that the better of schools can do. So there is no supervised learning that is taking place. And there is a real danger that when the children eventually get to school, they will be unable to get into the culture of schooling and into the culture of learning. That has to be very, very worrying. What then have we taken from this? The first that we need to know is that we've become so deeply aware of the society that we are, that is so divided. We are a divided society, both in terms of hospitals and hospital care, in schools and education, in law and order enforcement, in housing, in the provision of basic facilities like water. And it seems like any effort that government has taken so far to ensure that these services are provided is too little, too late. The president has said that government has become a lot more conscious that the economic system around which this country is organized at this point in time can no longer work, and that a new system needed to be devised post-COVID-19. We need to measure a new economy for South Africa. The truth of the matter, of course, is that South Africa's economy at the moment is at a junk status, and that the country really can't afford all that is being promised. And where the resources are going to come from to do this new way of being a constitutional state is very doubtful. So we don't know what kind of animal this new economy is going to be past COVID-19. Unemployment is very high. It was said that some 50% of able-bodied South Africans at the moment are out of work. And by all accounts, it's going to take a while before they're able to be back at employability stages. There are some concerns about migration and immigrants in this country, and whether this country can afford any longer to become a receiving state for immigrants, largely from neighboring countries like Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Lesotho. Can we continue to be a country that provides hospitality to neighboring states, and indeed asylum receiving country that we are? All of these are matters that are thrown out, and almost all of them are deeply hot issues, and they are moral questions about the nature of the society and about its future, and where we will be going as the new South Africa. One thing is clear, is that looking into the future, we are going to have to rethink a lot of the issues that are fundamental to the kind of society that we have been. We need to look at that straight in the eye, afresh, whether it's church, whether it's sport, whether it's politics, the economy, education, health, everything has been thrown up by this coronavirus that is all over our country at this moment. Thank you very much.